Welcome back for today's fifth mini lecture on the Constitution. And one of the most common comments that I got last semester, and I feel a lot more comfortable in front of this computer in the fall than I did in the spring. But at the end of the semester, the students were incredibly kind to me. I really appreciated it. They said that the course was great, yeah, yeah. But they said the two things that they noticed were that there weren't as many stories and that I wasn't as funny. And I told them what I think I told you in an earlier lecture. I'm looking at myself on a screen, and there's a timer in the bottom corner. But I told them that I would try to remember that for next semester. And when there was a story that I thought students particularly liked, I would add it even in this format. So certainly you can write me back and tell me the story was good, was funny, was awful, quit telling stories, or continue to tell them, or whatever you think. So we're getting to the colonial experience. I want to say a few things about it. Keep in mind that there was not a revolution in our country for well over a century and a half after colonists arrived. So the colonial experience was very long. It lasted over 150 years. People were proud to be part of the British Empire. But most importantly, strong regional identities were created. And so, for example, I told you on the Randall side, our family had been in this country for nearly 100 years when the revolution started out, and there was a very strong identity to Connecticut and to New England. I want to tell you a Randall story, though, about my favorite dead relative. It's my favorite story. There's a couple of real creeper stories that I didn't tell you earlier. But I want to tell you about one of my family members that fought in the Revolutionary War. And when I tell you the story, my guess is you're going to think that I made it up. But it is a true story and it is interesting. And I think it does demonstrate that these events that we talk about and learn about in history book that we have family members in many cases who were involved in these, and that if this hadn't happened, perhaps we wouldn't even be here. And certainly, this was, in my opinion, a real miracle. And if this set of facts had not occurred, if this man had not gone through this ordeal, I would not be here, and someone else would be teaching this course. So let me tell you my favorite Randall story related to the Revolutionary War in my family. So this involves the German side of my family, the Barnheisers, which arrived in this country around 1730 or 1740 from the very eastern part of Germany. And they were farmers. And when the Revolutionary War broke out, old John Barnheiser, and that's what I call him, went off to war. He was a relatively young farmer and married, and he goes off to fight the British, and he gets shot in battle. He gets captured by the British. He doesn't die from the wound. He doesn't die from the infection, which was much more likely to kill you than the actually bullet wound. He survived the prisoner of war camp and is swapped out in a prisoner exchange. So old John goes back out to battle again, gets shot by the British a second time, gets captured a second time. Once again, the bullet wound does not kill him, the infection does not kill him. He survives the war. He has 12 children with his first wife, and his first wife dies in childbirth with their 12th child. And many years go by, and old John becomes an old man approaching 70 years old in his late 60s. He meets a cute young thing. He gets married for a second time, and he has seven more children with this young woman. So that means old John had 19 children, 12 with his first wife, seven with his second wife. His 18th child, which is my ancestor, was born when he was 79 years old, and his last child was born when he was 81. So think about that. Here's a man who is shot twice, captured twice. His first wife dies. As an old man, somehow he's charming enough to attract a much younger woman, has seven more children with her, and that 18th child is my ancestor. And without that person, I wouldn't be here. So uh, I enjoy the genealogy because I've been fascinated by history for years, and the more I learn about various aspects of my family, I see the tie into history. So the Randalls are up in Connecticut during the colonial period. The Barnheisers are in Pennsylvania. The Italian side of my family, the Grecos, do not arrive until around 1900 or so, so they're not part of this story. The Rainiers arrive from France. They're actually from Marseille, where the Black Death entered Europe. They also do not come until after the Revolutionary War. So, two main branches of my family are here. So, thought you'd enjoy the story. And both of these men are fighting for the region of the country that they come from. The Randalls are fighting for Connecticut. The Barnheisers are fighting for Pennsylvania. And it's important to note this, and I think this is probably the major omission from chapter 2 in Greenberg and Page, is they don't give enough attention to this. Because if you read the Articles of Confederation, which is our first governmental system, most experts call it the failed experiment, the failed government, the failed something. And you'll see later in your notes that I don't perceive it this way at all. I think the Articles of Confederation were a prerequisite, that it only made sense that when our first government was created, that we would give ultimate political power to our new states, because the vast majority of people fighting in the Revolutionary War were fighting to their states. There were enlightened people who were more cosmopolitan. My favorite founding father, for example, Benjamin Franklin, was not one of these people. He said, "We are a new group of people, a new nation, Americans." But the vast majority of people thought of themselves as Virginians and Georgians, New Yorkers, etc. So there were some people, especially amongst the elites, who bought into this notion of a whole nation, but the vast majority of people were fighting for their states and wanted states' rights. And if you look at that first film, or if you've looked at that film on well, it's on federalism, so you probably haven't seen it yet. But when you get to it, it talks a little bit more like that. And we still have that debate today. I mean, there are things even today that the states decide. So, for example, when I went on my 18 state, 6,400-mile road trip during the summer of 2019, every time I got to a state border, the speed limit seemingly changed. So in California, it was 65 and 70, but there were places where the speed limit was as high as 80. And there is one highway in Texas where the speed limit is 90. So it varies. In some states, the death penalty is legal. In some states, the death penalty is illegal. At one time, this is no longer true, but one of the intriguing ones was drinking ages varied from state to state. Today, another example of states' rights is sexual consent ages vary. There are some states where consent is 16, some where it's 17, and of course in California, it's 18. So there are lots of examples of areas in which states determine their own rules. So the question, of course, is why wasn't there a revolution earlier? And I can see that I left some things out of the notes. It says the second. is the relationship was mutually beneficial. I think I said was the first impact was regional identities were created. Okay, and the second is that there was not a revolution for over 150 years, and the primary reason is it worked for everyone. The British believed that the colonies existed to benefit them, that the colonies were a captive market, and by that, and some of you know this, you may remember this from history, because of the great distance between Britain and the colonies, the British pretty much left the colonists alone, but there were a few things they were really highly insistent on. And at the top of that list was, we are your trade partners. So if you remember in History 17A, if you took the course here, or maybe even if you had a good history teacher, the Navigation Acts, the British wanted the colonists to trade only with them. Of course, did not happen. There were many colonists who engaged in illegal trafficking of commodities. That still occurs. If you read the newspaper or the news, you'll hear about people getting caught for trafficking in commodities that are illegal. The most famous during the colonial period were the rum runners who went down to the French West Indies and smuggled in rum, for example, would be an example. The British also saw the colonies as a source of raw materials. So you take raw materials from the colonies like cotton, and you turn cotton into a finished product, something like clothing, for example. Or you take finished product like timber, and you turn it into furniture or perhaps a ship or something else. For the colonists, what they got out of this relationship was protection. There were a lot of other people in the New World, including the French and at one time the Dutch. The Dutch probably should have become the great power in the world, but they were so into making money that they sold their best weapons to their enemies, who then used their weapons against them and killed them. So the Dutch were very industrious people and became very wealthy, but they lost their empire fairly quickly, and for the most part, at least in the New World. There were also various native peoples who weren't happy with the colonists being there. So, what I want you to know about the colonial period is that it lasted a long time and it was mutually beneficial. The colonists had a significant amount of freedom given the era. They were largely left alone. Many historians use the term salutary neglect. I just call it neglect. There was power sharing in the colonies. Most of the colonies, not all, had a bicameral legislature where one house was appointed by the crown, one was elected by the people. In some colonies, both houses were elected by the people. There was a power sharing that many believe is kind of the prerequisite for federalism. But essentially, what I want you to know about the colonial period is from the British perspective, the colonies were a source of prestige and power and primarily profits. So, profits, prestige, and power. For the colonists, the relationship brought them social order and protection. And so the relationship worked well. A very significant middle class and even an upper class developed in the colonies. This relationship worked for over a century and a half, and then very, very quickly, in about a decade period, we suddenly have an action reaction cycle, and that's what I would call it, an action reaction cycle to revolution. And so the obvious question is, how and why does a relationship that is stable, that is mutually beneficial, that is working for both sides, and in particular, underline that how the British perceived the colonies and how the colonists perceived Britain during the colonial period? And the answer is this war that you probably have heard of but don't know much about, the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War, fundamentally changes this relationship in a fundamental way.